Chapter 8. Despite graduating from what was one of the best schools in Philadelphia, somewhere down the line I forgot to pat myself on the back. My self-esteem somehow gradually slipped back down to rock bottom. I may have graduated from a school where many graduates went on to success in Ivy League colleges, but I didn't dare dream of such lofty ideals. Rather than Doogie Howser, MD, I was going to be Homer Simpson. For as much as I knew that I had made it through one of the toughest academic environments in town, I hadn't seen any other deaf role models around. Apparently, being the first deaf guy to graduate from GFS has both positive and negative implications. On the one hand, I had accomplished something that was once considered impossible, and that certainly was commendable. On the other hand, I was in uncharted territory. I had no deaf role models to follow. Where was I supposed to go from here? I had no idea. My hearing classmates may have gone on to medical school or various prestigious positions in science, business, and entertainment, but they were hearing. What was a deaf guy to do? In a way, I was a victim of a self-imposed glass ceiling. I surmised that my hearing classmates were, of course, going to be successful because they were hearing. They had the leadership qualities I didn't. I may have improved after getting an interpreter, but I was still a few steps behind. Being a leader was out of the question. There was a situation where a good idea was needed. Someone else had already come up with a solution by the time the problem was efficiently communicated to me through the interpreter. Lots of times I would raise my hand 2 or 3 seconds after everyone else due to the small delay, and then curse under my breath as the teacher called on some other student who gave me the precise same answer that I'd planned to share. Train gone, sorry. I was close, but never equal. Not being equal to anyone gave me an excuse to sell myself short. My breakup with Karen further reinforced my belief that a deaf guy just didn't have much of a fair shot at succeeding in a hearing world. Although we managed to remain friends, it was painful at first to see how easily Karen met and dated other men. She was having the time of her life with a hearing guy who had much more to offer her than I ever could, and I was back to striking out with the ladies. I was going nowhere fast. I had no dreams or aspirations. If I landed any job at all, be it flipping burgers at McDonald's or washing windshields with a squeegee at street intersections, it would be not bad for a deaf guy. Eventually, I got a part-time job as a supermarket clerk. It was okay, nothing fancy. To me, it was the end of the road. Since this job was not bad for a deaf guy, I made it my career goal. Maybe someday I could manage a general merchandise department. Who knows? Even if that never happened, I was still doing pretty good because everybody sing along with me. Not bad for a deaf guy. Needless to say, this was probably the lowest point of my life. Grandpop was gone, my love life was non-existent, and I was in a rut while stocking the same shelves every day at work. There had to be more to life than this. Something was missing. I grew tired of this horribly empty feeling. If I'd had any guts, I would have uprooted and started all over someplace new. In fact, I mentioned this to some of my hearing friends at a party one evening. I told them that I'd heard of this place called NTID, National Technical Institute for the Deaf, in Rochester, and was thinking of going there. Perhaps it was time to move on and hang out with some people like myself for a change. But it never happened. Not only were my friends able to talk me out of it, I didn't think I was ready for such a move yet anyway. I was in a rut, but it was a comfortable rut in the hometown I had lived in all my life. One of my friends told me that I didn't need to look anywhere for happiness. I simply needed to look inward and find more confidence. I needed to be more assertive, needed to believe in myself. Only then would things start to look up. He definitely had a good point there. I was in dire need of an attitude overhaul. After some soul searching, I found an intriguing answer: the martial arts. This was not entirely out of the blue. I had taken Shotokan a few years earlier, and it had left an indelible impression. I remember how I'd always looked forward to class, and I realized that the martial arts had this knack for filling a gap in my life. What did I have to lose? Perhaps it was time to start up again. After checking out some of the schools in my neighborhood, I decided to enroll in Taekwondo school in nearby Willow Grove. Not surprisingly, it turned out to be a valuable experience. First and foremost, Taekwondo, as well as many other martial arts, is physically relaxing and cathartic. If you have any pent-up stress or frustration, this is the perfect outlet. Not only do you release negative tension, but you also pick up positive vibes from your teacher and students when you work out in harmony. You develop an ability to focus and stay tuned in the present moment, which is key to inner peace. It does wonders for your state of mind. Not long after taking up Taekwondo, the difference in the way I carried myself was noticeable. In fact, the 2 times that I had to take an extended leave of absence from training, once for a hernia operation and again after a freak surfing accident, my boss at work observed a big difference in my usually calmer demeanor. My tolerance level in difficult situations had wanted somewhat compared to when I regularly practiced in Taekwondo. On a different level, Taekwondo improved my self-esteem. When I started my training, I noticed that the advanced students looked awesome as they executed difficult techniques with smooth precision. I could believe that someday I too would be performing the same complex routines. Sure enough, as time went by, I improved and I realized I could routinely accomplish what I had once thought was impossible. It taught me the value of patience and perseverance. If at this point it appears that I'm getting too big for my britches regarding martial arts skills, hang on for a second. That also is naturally taken care of by the rigors of training. When I had a green belt, about intermediate level, I began thinking that maybe I was the second coming of Bruce Lee. This is understandable because it is at this stage when beginners start to become adept at all of the basic techniques. Instead of awkward, offensive kicks, I began to deliver powerful blows with speed and accuracy. Whomp! I could literally feel the energy surging through me. Damn, I was good. Or so I thought. Eventually, I worked my way up to a more advanced level of a red belt. All of my hard work was paying off. I was able to master the more difficult techniques and soon would be testing for a black belt. I was warming up one day when I noticed one of the green belts going through his repertoire of kicks and punches. I thought, he's pretty good, but he's got a long way to go. All of a sudden, at that moment, it hit me. I realized that statement not only applied to the green belt, but to me as well. As a green belt, I thought I knew everything. As a red belt, I knew in retrospect that I was wrong. Not only that, I realized that at the present moment, even as a red belt, I still knew nothing compared to what was ahead. And of course, as a black belt, I would likewise know nothing compared to the path beyond. It was a humbling insight. Once you get such insights from your training, it adds a spiritual dimension to your life. You begin to question the meaning of some things, and you realize that you have a power deep inside you that you were never aware of before. I think we all have this power. It lies dormant within us, patiently waiting until we're ready to wake up, kick some butt. But we all have more ability and wisdom than we give ourselves credit for. It just takes a certain amount of self-actualization before one is ready to unleash it. Once I realized this, I turned into an Eastern philosophy enthusiast. I read everything I could get my hands on about Zen, Buddhism, Taoism, and all sorts of spiritual literature. I became a strong believer in the inner voice, an insight junkie. Anytime there was a moment of inspiration, of wordless understanding, where things just somehow made sense, a light bulb clicked in my head. Brain candy. I wanted more. And all it took was a few moments of introspection. Ironically, during my school years, I had been cultivating an awareness of the inner voice all along. From 3rd grade at PMFS through my senior year at GFS, both of which were friends' schools of the Quaker background in philosophy, I had been a participant in weekly meetings for worship. This involved the whole school getting together in a meeting house and sitting still doing nothing. It was a form of meditation that I would get into even more as a martial artist. The whole idea behind this meeting for worship was that we all have a light within. If at any time someone had a brilliant inspiration, it was believed to come from God. If such an inspiration arose, one was encouraged to stand up and break the silence by sharing the inspiration with others. After all of my experiences in Judaism and Catholicism, I realized that I had blended the best of Quakerism. After all, there were no hard set rules, no you should do this or you should do that. Instead, we were encouraged to trust ourselves and the voice within. There is a little bit of God in each of us, and I still believe that to this very day. I might be a bit biased in my opinion for obvious reasons. In Judaism and Catholicism, I was never an equal. In the meditative silence of Quakerism, we're all one and the same. No spiritual rank and order, no straining to understand what's going on, just a bunch of people sitting together in oneness. Obviously, the martial arts further reinforced the Quaker philosophy to which I had grown accustomed. I also realized that in the past, my inner voice had played a valuable role in my life even before I knew it was there. Somehow, it had warned me against the perils of discrimination. Somehow, I had known it was wrong when my friend Siku was treated unfairly because he was black. Somehow, I had known it was wrong when I heard anti-Semitic or anti-Catholic comments. If you allow it to do so, your inner voice can be a tremendous guide. I vowed from there on that I would always trust my inner voice. It had never let me down. Coming back to earth and getting back to Taekwondo, I eventually earned a black belt in the fall of 1990. At the time, it was my most memorable achievement to date. It was one of the few things I had done entirely on my own. For just about everything else I had accomplished, someone else had pushed me along the way. Taekwondo was a path I chose to pursue alone, by my own volition. There were times I would come home exhausted with an assortment of strains and sprains. Occasionally, family members would shake their heads and wonder out loud why I put myself through all this. But the martial arts had succeeded in teaching me a valuable lesson. I learned that when we bear down and put our minds to it, we can accomplish anything. With all of the previous musings about religion and the martial arts, you might assume that by my early 20s, I was well on my way to becoming the next Paramahansa Yogananda. I'm not so fast. Remember, we're talking about a naive, deaf kid who still has a lot of growing up to do. The words girls, beach, keg party, and beer bong still held a lot more appeal. Say it's time to start thinking about what you want to do with your life. On top of that, I was still a fish out of water, a deaf person trying to blend in with hearing people. So, of course, I would continue making more mistakes and questionable decisions, especially during the first few years as a hopeless, clueless college student. Both academically and socially, I was on a roller coaster of uncertainty. At Temple University, I found myself on academic probation one semester and pulled a 3.3 GPA the next. I was an accounting major one year, a psych major the next. What in the world was I doing there? I had no idea. Social life was practically non-existent. There was too many faces, all of them hearing. My best friends were my interpreters, Alex and Mike. Without them, I would have flunked out due to academic incompetence or total boredom, whichever came first. At home, I mostly hung out with the same group of friends I had played baseball with. At this point in time, we were no longer the cute little ball players who won Little League, Pony League, and Summer Rec League championships. We were now bona fide party animals. Hanging out with my buddies was always fun, especially before we turned 21. Old enough to hang out, but too young to hit the bars. We usually had to resort to sports for a good time. We would play baseball, basketball, touch football, and street hockey. When we were done with baseball, we joined organized softball leagues. We were forever young, at least until we hit 21. Once we were old enough to go out to clubs, something changed in the social dynamics. When we were immersed in sports, I could deal with not understanding everything people said. I was able to have enough fun shooting baskets or hitting home runs so that if I missed some conversational tidbits here and there, it didn't really bother me. But it was a completely different story when I started hitting the bars. Rather than passing a ball around, my friends were just standing there, beer in hand, hoping to meet some chicks. I still had a lot of fun hanging out with the guys, but it was harder to interact. I could talk to almost anyone one-on-one, but immediately fell out of the loop whenever it expanded into a group conversation. It could be fun one moment and excruciatingly boring the next. To get through the boring interludes, I would order more drinks. If I was hopelessly out of a conversation, back to the bar I went. While everyone was talking, I was drinking. After 7 or so beers, I would have a good buzz going. Then suddenly, I would reemerge from the depths of isolation to once again become the life of the party. Whether it was giving someone a wedgie, telling X-rated jokes, or doing the old pull-my-finger routine, I had become an alcohol-driven animal. I may not have been a great conversationalist, but I could sure get everyone loose with rowdy physical behavior. If you heard a whoopee cushion go off, you could bet I wasn't too far from the scene of the crime. During the summer months, I would get especially crazy. I was practically swimming in beer. Every year, we would rent a house at the Jersey Shore, and the antics would begin. Initially, we rented at Wildwood, but eventually toned it down somewhat for us and got a nice place at the more laid-back Long Beach Island. Hanging out with everyone at the shore was much more enjoyable than going to the bars in the city. I knew everyone well. We had fun on the beach, and we'd partied hard together in our beach house. Of course, I was still lost in group conversations, but nonetheless managed to find a way to have fun. Perhaps the best thing about it was that despite the occasional frustrations, I could still laugh at myself. Sometimes it was all I could do. One such incident that comes to mind occurred on the boardwalk in Wildwood. On one hot sunny afternoon, I had decided to go for a walk. It was a beautiful day, and I loved hitting the boards where all the stores and arcades were. I took off by myself, leaving behind all my friends who had yet to wake up and recover from the partying we had done the night before. Ah, this was the life. The sun shined brightly as I strolled the boards, and there were plenty of eye candy, glittery gift shops on my left, the waves of the ocean gently rolling on my right, and of course hot women in bikinis. In fact, many of these gorgeous babes were looking at me. I nonchalantly strutted by, basking in all the attention. Obviously, they must have admired my muscular body. Okay, so I had to suck in my gut a little, but so what? I grinned at the ladies. In fact, the fact that their eyes were still following me further inflated my adolescent's hormone-raged ego. Remember that scene in Saturday Night Fever where John Travolta strutted down the street to thumping disco music? Replaced the leisure suit with Bermuda shorts and real groovy sunglasses, and that was me. Soon, however, I got the feeling that something wasn't right. Another group of women stared at me as I walked by. But this time I noticed it wasn't in the admiring glance my ego had deluded me into perceiving the first time around. Not only that, I immediately spotted a group of guys who were really giving me the eye. Instinctively, I looked behind me. Oh, Lord, there was a tram car right on my heels, loaded with about 50 passengers. Not only was the driver beeping his horn and yelling at me to get out of the way, but I also learned that there was a loud pre-recorded "Watch the tram car, please," blaring repeatedly over the speakers. My face turned bright red, and I felt like crawling under the boardwalk. When I got back to the house, I told the guys what had happened. We all had a good laugh over it. What else could I do? For the rest of the summer, they would jokingly go to extremes to tackle me or push me out of the way whenever a tram car was remotely in the vicinity. Sometimes you just have to laugh. Laugh, and the world laughs with you. Sure, sometimes they're laughing at you, but you just have to smile and move on. In between partying it up at the beach and my academic endeavors at Temple, I managed to continue my successful career as a supermarket clerk. My salary steadily rose over 4 years I worked there, from 1984 to 1988, and I was given more responsibility. Not bad for a deaf guy. When I finished college, if that was even necessary, I could go full-time at the store and then settle down for life. Why not? I enjoyed the environment I was in, and most of the customers knew me well. Indeed, there were plenty of good memories. One day, there was a psychotic woman who had lost all touch with reality in the store, and she stripped naked, screaming all the while at the top of her lungs. She appeared to be about 300 pounds, and her yelling could be heard throughout the whole building. except for me, of course. While everyone could hear her coming and quickly got out of the way, she rumbled straight toward the aisle where I worked. The entire crew from the department, thinking quickly, ran to my aisle. No, not to help. They wanted to watch. They knew this was going to be good. The guys gathered at the end of the aisle and peeked around the end shelf. It must have taken them all the restraint in the world not to laugh. Meanwhile, I was lost in thought as I quietly marked up boxes of cigars, blissfully oblivious to this naked version of Godzilla screaming in my face. When I finally looked up and saw what stood before me, I did what must have been a double take of the century. Yeah, I must have jumped 2 feet in the air. I fumbled the cigars and dropped a few boxes on the floor. Jesus Christ, what the... Completely disoriented, I abandoned my post and stumbled out of there in a catatonic state of shock. The guys were laughing hysterically as it began to hit me that yes, there really was a large naked woman yelling at me. The police arrived shortly afterward, and order was soon restored. Sure, the whole thing was over in a few minutes, actually maybe a bit longer. I later heard that 2 police officers were arguing with each other because neither of them wanted to be the one who had to handcuff our oversized and undressed friend. Believe me, the guys who were there that day will be talking about this for years. Another exciting incident at the supermarket happened during the time I worked the night shift. Given how there were few people around the store in the wee hours of the morning, this shift could be excruciatingly boring at times. On one typically dull graveyard shift, I took a much-needed coffee break and noticed that a couple of employees were behaving strangely. They were visibly shaken, and one of them actually trembled as she sipped from her cup. You'd think that the place had just been robbed or something. As it turned out, the place had been robbed. Cashiers, front desk employees, and a customer or 2 were lying on the floor while a pair of gunmen emptied the registers. Meanwhile, I was nonchalantly stocking shelves no more than 2 aisles away from all the mayhem. I had just turned around the corner of the aisle. I would have been peeing myself instead of moping about how boring it was. As exciting as it was to be working with nude women and masked gunmen, there was still the gnawing sense that something was missing. Whatever it was that was sorely lacking in my life, I didn't fully understand. Fortunately for me, there was a kind soul named Linda Bain who certainly had the answer. Linda was a new coordinator of the resident education at the Pennsylvania School for the Deaf who ran the dormitory and the after-school program. Sometime in December 1987, a dorm supervisor left his job and Linda needed to find a replacement over the Christmas break. She had 10 days to find someone. By chance, she happened to be at the staff party where my mother was also in attendance. Somehow my name came up over the course of conversation, and Linda suddenly remembered me from a time we had met briefly once before. A few years ago, I had been asked by PSD to be a guest speaker on a panel involving deaf people with different educational backgrounds. A number of people were curious about what it was like for me when I was the only deaf student at GFS. So I showed up and answered some questions. As fate would have it, Linda was the interpreter at the event. Fast forward to 1987, and here she was at the staff party, learning that I was still in the area and passing time as a supermarket clerk. She immediately figured out that I would be perfect candidate for the job opening as a resident advisor and after-school program basketball slash baseball coach. She knew that not only would the kids learn from me, but I would learn from them as well. I still had a poor deaf identity back then, and Linda knew just what I needed. Linda went out of her way to visit me at the supermarket, and she convinced me that it was time to try something new. She pulled me aside as I was stocking shelves and told me about the job opening at PSD, suggesting it would be a great opportunity in more ways than one. The job required supervising 14 kids in a dorm, planning and running evening activities, and coordinating occasional off-campus trips. In addition to that, there would be the aforementioned coaching responsibilities for the after-school program. I would coach sports from 2:30 to 4. Then after that was done, I would head to the dorm and work there until 11 p.m. The supermarket paid better, yes, but the deal with PSD included free room and board. I would get my own room on the board's floor and be able to live there throughout the whole school year, even on weekends when my dorm kids went home. I could practically hear my party animal friends cheering wildly at the thought of me having my own place. Toga, toga, toga. As much as the decision should have been a no-brainer, I struggled with it for a while. It represented a massive change in a comfortable, safe, boring life I led. Of the 14 kids, I would be responsible for only a small number of them stayed in the dorm because they lived too far away for daily transportation. The rest were in there because certain social workers had recommended such an arrangement. These kids had such difficult lives at home that it was agreed a dorm would offer a safer, accessible environment conducive to learning. This job was no piece of cake. It was going to be a big challenge, and I knew it. On top of that, the supermarket still paid very good money. But then again, the supermarket wasn't providing me with my own place. Toga, toga, toga. As I continued to wrestle with the decision, Linda could have easily hired someone else while I stalled in the face of the fast approaching deadline. Instead, she actually came to see me 2 more times to further explain why this job would not only be a great experience, but also an opportunity for tremendous personal growth. From a financial standpoint, I was ready to turn her down, seeing how I was due for yet another raise in just a few months. Yet something gnawed at me inside, and Linda did a great job of selling me on the virtue of PSD. Finally, with no more than a day or 2 left on the deadline, I called Linda and told her that I accepted. Working at PSD was an entirely new experience. My entire existence prior to that involved being the only deaf guy at school, at work, or on the baseball field. Consequently, I was always out of the loop and had no choice but to follow what others were doing. Finally, it was time to stop being a follower and start being a leader. For the first time in my life, I had a considerable number of kids looking up to me for guidance. I didn't always have the answers, but Linda always had faith in me. Although she preferred to let me learn by doing, Linda gladly offered advice whenever I needed it. As with Deborah, my interpreter at GFS, I was once again under the wing of a hearing person, teaching me how to be deaf. At times, it was hard for me to admit that a hearing person could be so much more fluent than I was in ASL, as was the case with both Deb and Linda, but I knew I was gaining valuable insight. On one occasion, Linda handed me a memo from the administration. It was an important announcement that needed to be shared with the kids in the dorm. Linda went over the memo with me and asked if I could explain everything to the kids. Oh, sure, I signed to her. I'll run it by them, signing it over step by step. If the kids don't understand, I'll drop my signing to ASL and repeat it. Well, wait a minute, Linda intervened. You mean you will adjust or switch to ASL? I had signed drop, as if ASL was one notch below English. Often used at the time, Linda clarified that ASL is not inferior. Both English and ASL are legitimate languages in their own right. Most prelingually deaf kids respond to and learn better from ASL. From that point on, I made a conscious effort to improve my ASL skills as much as possible. Thus began the rebirth of a true deaf, capitalized D, emphasized, man, or as the saying goes, the ASL true business deaf. For me, the door to a new world had just opened. Everything at PSD turned out to be one new learning experience after another. I soon discovered that during the morning and early afternoon hours, the recreation room of the dorm doubled as a playroom for an early intervention program. As previously explained, deaf children and hearing parents are usually behind in overall linguistic and cognitive development due to lack of effective communication during their formative years. Early intervention is where they work at closing the gap. Again, from the ages of birth to 5, there is a crucial window for children to pick up language. If sufficient communication has not occurred during these years, the child begins school having to play catch-up. This gap is the key reason why many deaf adults today can barely read at a 4th grade level. Some deaf people, like my parents, also blame the old oral schools. They insist that if they had received sign language instruction in their day, they could have learned so much more. In an early intervention program, I noticed that there was a comprehensive plan designed to facilitate the deaf child's social, emotional, intellectual, and linguistic development. Parents would come in with their deaf toddlers and drop them off in a play area where they got to interact with other deaf children. In addition to this, PSD also offered home-based services. They were supervised all the while by staff fluent in ASL who would lead fun activities designed to develop communication skills. Meanwhile, the parents would go upstairs and work with other PSD staff who would educate them on ways to accelerate their child's development. Sign language classes are also offered, and this, of course, makes all the difference in the world. Although I could understand the overall philosophy of early intervention program, its importance never really struck me until several years later, when a deaf couple I know began raising their 3 deaf children. My friends George and Val Oshman communicated with their kids exclusively through ASL. Their oldest child, Travis, completely won me over on the virtues of ASL when he was only 4 years of age. There were 2 incidents that stand out in particular. Incidents that I have always referred to when advocating on behalf of ASL for deaf children. The first incident occurred when Travis's mom flew to Chicago to be with a relative who had fallen ill. Everyone at PSD was enamored when they saw 4-year-old Travis signing in fluent ASL, explaining to his teachers that his mom specifically flew to Chicago to help take care of the sick relative in question. His signing skills and ability to effectively communicate exactly what was happening, including the relevant who, what, when, where, and whys, was way advanced for a deaf child his age. In fact, he got in more detail than what you'd expect from any 4-year-old, deaf or hearing. Most deaf children at that age, especially those who come from hearing families where there is no sign language communication, would have only been able to say something like "Mom, fly gone," or just "Mom, gone," without the skills to elaborate any further. To see Travis signing "Mom flew to Chicago" because truly demonstrated the benefits of early exposure to ASL. The second example with Travis is hilarious yet enlightening. One day, George and Val discovered that their dog had somehow escaped from the yard and was nowhere to be seen. In their endeavor to find the dog, which fortunately was successful, they made lost dog posters to distribute in their neighborhood. 4-year-old Travis accompanied Val as she stapled some of the posters on telephone poles. Initially, Travis did not understand what was going on. He asked his mom why they were posting up pictures of their dog. In ASL, Val explained that if someone in the neighborhood saw the dog, they would recognize it from the posters and call their home. Travis indicated he understood how it worked and proceeded to help his mom put the posters up. A few minutes later, they came across a telephone pole that had a poster of a man running for office. Travis tugged on his mom's shirt and pointed at the picture of the political candidate. "Mom, is his mom upset because he's lost too?" Travis asked. Val cracked up and explained that the politician's poster was for an entirely different reason. Granted, Travis had made a cute assumption with his 4-year-old logic. It was amusing how he made the connection between the dog and the politician, but it was also significant in showing his level of cognitive development. His brain was clicking on all cylinders. He might have jumped to the wrong conclusion, but that was irrelevant. The important thing was that he was thinking. He was putting 2 and 2 together in his cute way that only a 4-year-old can. He was fine-tuning his logic and reasoning skills. Had his parents not been able to communicate efficiently with him from day one in a language that is fully accessible to him, he might not have come close to the level of thinking and communication where he is today. Instead of the painful "never mind" or "I'll tell you later" that many deaf children get from their parents, Travis got all the input any growing child so rightfully deserves. By taking notes of Travis's experience, you can see why PSD's early intervention program, as well as numerous other programs throughout the country, advocates early exposure to language, particularly ASL. By encouraging the use of ASL and an understanding of deafness, the early intervention program helps parents close the communication gap with their deaf children so that they are better equipped to deal with the upcoming school years. Most important of all, it improves many parent-child relationships. What greater gift than to be able to communicate with your parents? Pardon me if it appears I'm beginning to get a bit preachy about ASL. I admit that it's not as easy as I make it seem. I have also, throughout my observation and brief interaction with the early intervention program, come to understand how hard it can be on parents to have to deal with deafness long before they ever get around to joining a sign language class. It is not easy at all. It's not as simple as, oh, you just need to take an ASL class and you'll be fine. It's a lot more complicated than that. Several parents have more needs than just learning ASL. They often have a number of other difficult issues they must work through. Some or all may have a lingering feeling of shock or denial, anger, and even guilt left over from the initial diagnosis of their child's deafness. One parent admitted feeling embarrassed when her child signed in public and consequently felt guilty. Did she not have a moral obligation to love her child unconditionally instead of worrying about what others thought? Through the support of other parents in the program, she found that she was not alone in having those and many other thoughts and feelings. Consequently, she was able to deal with them better. Conversely, through the early intervention program, I found out that I was not alone either. I only worked with the early intervention staff once or twice when they asked me to share my own personal experience with parents, but I learned so much from it. For the first time, I could see deafness through my hearing grandparents' eyes. I could never understand what the big deal was in the way that they reacted or overreacted to my deafness. When talking with parents in the early intervention program, I finally got a sense of what my grandparents had gone through. I could finally understand their pain and difficulty in accepting my deafness. One parent of a prelingually deaf child caught me using my voice, which is not perfect but pretty comprehensible, and wanted to know nothing else but how her own child could develop his voice similarly. It was hard to explain to her that I had lost my hearing after acquiring speech skills, and that communication in ASL was probably more desirable for her child. Seeing the parents' initial denial, however, helped me better understand the denial I saw in my own family. Not only did I understand now, but also I was able to accept it and even laugh about it. In fact, shortly before I quit my supermarket job for good, I initially made an ill-advised attempt at moonlighting before switching solely to PSD. There was this one time that a relative came into the store. She approached Jim, a coworker and good friend of mine, asking him where she could find me. The thing was, there were two people named Mark working at the time. Jim tried to clarify by asking, Mark in the produce section or the deaf Mark? The relative in question gasped and gave him a shocked look. When she composed herself, she retorted, "He's not deaf." Jim scratched his head, backed off, and told her to wait a second, and then came into the back room where I was on break. Mark, he began, "I have good news and bad news. The good news is you're not deaf anymore. Congratulations. The bad news is one of your relatives is out there. She's pissed." Rather than getting into a family argument, I just took a deep breath, smiled, and went out there. I greeted the relative and laughed about it with Jim later on. Instead of being angry, I actually understood the denial behind the whole incident. It was nothing personal, no insult. I would just let the relative deal with it in whichever way she could. Later, when she was ready, she would come to accept my deafness and even make an effort to learn sign language. Speaking of sign language, I must admit that however desirable, you can't just learn ASL overnight. It takes time and commitment. Some people have a lot of trouble when it comes to acquiring ASL. My grandfather, for example, was so uncoordinated in his signing skills that anytime he tried to sign the letter D, it inadvertently wound up giving the finger. Regardless of whether or not anyone is a natural at picking up sign language, it is certainly worth the effort if you have a deaf child. They deserve to be in an environment where they are comfortable and have access to all that is being said around them. Even if your signing skills are marginal at best, deaf children can and do become accustomed to your accent of signing and are grateful that you have taken the effort to learn. Let me tell you, I can relate to this firsthand. When I started work at PSD, it felt so good to be able to relax and just soak up all the information that came through so clearly in sign language. It didn't matter if any signing came from native ASLers or new signers who struggled to find the right signs. The important thing was access, and for the first time in a long time, I had plenty. Some parents of deaf children choose to take a different, more radical approach: cochlear implants. This involves surgically implanting an electrode array in the cochlea and a receiver/stimulator in the vicinity of the mastoid bone behind the ear. When combined with an outer microphone that can be worn externally behind the ear, this system works as a bypass, carrying sound around the damaged inner ear nerves that do not function properly. This is not a bona fide cure for deafness. However, there have been varying results and varying benefits, such as awareness of environmental sounds, some ability to recognize speech, and some improved speech reading. But there has never been a case of Joe deaf going under the knife and coming out of it Joe hearing. Although technology has been steadily improving, the cochlear implant is not exactly a miracle cure. This is part of the book where I would like to drop the subject like a hot potato and jump ahead to the next chapter. Let the cochlear implant advocates and opposing slug it out somewhere else. I have better things to do. But no, every time I do a guest speaking gig somewhere, there are always people who inevitably ask, "So Marky, how about that cochlear implant? You plan on getting one soon?" Let's get this over with once and for all and address a topic I'm no longer sure how to address. When the first edition of Deaf Again came out in 1997, I trashed the cochlear implant. My reaction when the implant first came out was somewhere along the lines of, they invented a what? They surgically implant it where? Get that thing away from me. With all due respect to those who have a cochlear implant or are close to someone who does, I'm going to share why I reacted the way I did. I understand that there are many people out there with varying experiences and opinions about the sensitive topic, so I won't claim to have all the answers. But one thing I can do is show you how the whole thing initially looked to a culturally deaf person struggling to find balance in his life. Today, my attitude is more accepting now that I have the opportunity to meet several people who actually like their implants. But just for fun, let's go back to the days when I vehemently opposed it. After you've read this book from cover to cover, hopefully without falling asleep, you will notice the theme here is a Shakespeare one: to thine own self be true. Let's face it, I failed as a hearing person. All of the attempts at fixing me did not work. It was frustrating and drove me up the wall. All of the trips to the otolaryngologist after being operated on 4 times, to have tubes put in my ears, after being subjected to countless audiologist exams, after being fitted for hearing aids, after being forced to take speech therapy, after constant reminders to sit up front and read lips no matter how exhausting it was, I'd had it. I'd absolutely had it. Couldn't these people just leave me alone? Couldn't they stop poking around in my ears? Although I never really spoke up when I was younger, deep down inside, I always wished that people would stop obsessing over my ears. I simply wanted them to appreciate me, the whole person. Couldn't they stop trying to fix me and just accept me for who I was? That was all I ever wanted. Eventually that happened. Well, sort of. As you will see in upcoming chapters, the hearing folks in my family would soon come to terms with my deaf identity. It was clearly obvious to them that in my case, hearing aids and speech therapy could not compete with what ASL and the deaf community had to offer. As I found my new environment at PSD, sign language gave me the opportunity to be 100% receptive to all that was going on around me. No amount of speech therapy or medical intervention could ever come close to providing me with that kind of satisfaction. Finally, even those with the most hard autist mentality backed off. It was a tremendous relief. Finally, I felt like I was free to be me, the genuine, true business deaf me. Until that is, my family got wind of the cochlear implant. It was as if their autist ideals had crawled out from beneath the surface to antagonize me yet again. Once they heard about the implant, they were relentless, and all I could think was make it go away. You can imagine my frustration when relatives tried to sell me onto the virtues of the cochlear implant. After all these years, they had finally let go of their pathological fix-it philosophy, but thanks to this new gizmo, they were back. They would bring it up in conversation. They would clip the latest magazine article and mail them to me. They would utilize the worst weapon of them all, Jewish guilt. Don't you know how happy your grandmother would be if you could hear birds singing? They were everywhere. It drove me nuts. The worst argument came from a relative who said, "But Mark, you're so smart. You can learn how to hear." I sighed in exasperation. The implied correlation between intelligence and deafness left me scratching my head. Later on, I would learn that this is a common misconception. There are many who erroneously assume that deaf people who have residual hearing and speech ability are smarter than those who do not. With a similar mindset of my own, family apparently thought it was my level of intelligence, not my degree of hearing loss, that made me a viable candidate for the cochlear implant. Of course, I know that when they bug me about the cochlear implant, they do it out of love. They want me to hear because in an auditory-oriented world, the idea of life without sound must be absolutely incomprehensible. Understandably, they want to reacquaint me with the world of sound. But little do they understand that in my eyes, it seems like they simply cannot accept me for who I am. On more than one occasion, we've argued about this to no avail. All we can do is respectfully agree to disagree. Hey, we're family, it's cool. In my other book, Anything But Silent, you can find all the gory details of one particularly crazy cochlear debate in a segment titled The Impossible Ideal. In a nutshell, I came out of it thinking that to some people in my family, it doesn't matter what I accomplish in life. To them, I will always be the guy who can't hear. Ouch. With this experience in mind, of course, I cringe when I hear about young children getting implanted before they're old enough to make an informed decision for themselves. For those who truly want a cochlear implant, that's absolutely fine with me. To each his own. I can't help but wonder if their families are consciously or subconsciously imposing auditory-based ideals onto them. I wonder if these children will grow up stuck in a world where they feel obligated to be something that they are not. Kids naturally want to please their parents, but this is quite a lot to ask. Further compounding the issue is the phenomenon we refer to as plasticity. As I mentioned before, it's been proven that the best window of opportunity for learning language is between birth and age 5. When you see a 4-year-old effortlessly learning how to speak Russian and French, while a 60-year-old is struggling just to read the directions on how to operate a can opener. You're witnessing two very different levels of plasticity right there. I'd like to take a moment to expound on this. Apparently, the brain has an easier time establishing neural pathways that allow for quicker learning during the first few years of life. Research on this subject appears to indicate that as early as the age of 3, plasticity begins to wane. So if a child hasn't had sufficient opportunity to learn language by 5, the odds are great that this child will be significantly delayed in terms of language and other areas such as spelling and writing for the rest of his or her life. Note, special thanks to Dr. Gerald Barnhart for explaining this to me. You didn't think I went out and became a neuroscientist overnight, did you? What with our understanding of plasticity, it's no surprise that parents are rushing to get their deaf infants and toddlers implanted at earlier and earlier ages. They're taking advantage of scientifically proven window of opportunity. I totally understand the logic behind it, and it's behind the same logic where I will vouch for over and over the benefits of sign language for all babies, deaf and hearing, implanted or not. So there you have it, my bona fide opinion. I'm more open-minded and accepting of the cochlear implant, but at the same time, I'm chagrined when people think they need to shield their deaf children from sign language. Sign language is 100%, repeat after me, 100% accessible. If you're using sign language alone, and many parents of both deaf and hearing babies are doing so with remarkable success, then you have 100% access to language. If you have children who are implanted, that's fine. You can use sign language in conjunction with that to fill the gaps. And there will be gaps. No technology is 100% efficient. Bombard those neural pathways. Make the most of them while they're still there. That's all I have to say about it. I guess you could say that nowadays I'm more concerned about language acquisition than the cochlear implant itself. Cochlear implants for babies and young children continue to be something people will argue passionately about for hours on end without coming to an agreement. If you watch the movie Sound and Fury, you'll see how the cochlear implant decision can split an entire family in half. As for my opinion, the jury's still out. I work in a deaf school and I see more and more kids with the cochlear implant. Yet they're still in a deaf school and they're still deaf. It makes me think that with all the surgery, related risks, follow-up appointments, intensive auditory speech training, all with no guarantee of success, maybe it's just not worth it. Then again, I see several parents on internet mailing lists who laud the success of their implanted children in mainstream programs. These are kids I haven't met, so who am I to determine whether or not the implant works? Furthermore, as mentioned before, I now work with several kids who have the implant. Some of them like it, some of them hate it. Either way, I work with them and their parents. In the past, I've read about parents signing their kids up for surgery and doing everything in their power to keep those kids as far away from the world of ASL and deaf culture. Now that upsets me. Nowadays, I'm seeing more parents of implanted kids learning ASL and encouraging their kids to make the most of everything they have, socializing with deaf friends, using ASL, and making the most of whatever benefits their implant offers them. This is more of a happy medium that I can live with. These parents are no longer looking at the implant as a magic cure-all. They're simply looking at it as another option that may or may not improve their child's hearing. They are also under pressure to make a difficult decision, spurred on by doctors and research, which indicates the earlier a child is implanted, the better. Do I want to burn bridges with these folks? No. While I personally prefer that someone be old enough to decide for himself or herself before getting an implant, I'm not going to carry a political agenda against those who feel differently. I already know several deaf adults who have an implant and are powerful members of the deaf community. It's great to have them with us. Do I want to alienate them? No. Can you see how I've struggled to come to grips with the cochlear implant? Keeping in mind that I'm just one guy among hundreds of thousands who have vastly different opinions, if you really want to know if this thing works, I'd recommend you go out and interview a large number of people who have one. That's my philosophy. If you really want to understand deafness, ask deaf people. If you really want to understand cochlear implants, ask the deaf people who have them. Get to the root of the source. They'll be able to provide you with the real scoop. For those of you who are still wondering if my opinion has changed enough to the point where I'd want a cochlear implant myself, nope, I still don't want one. I'm very comfortable with my deaf identity, thank you very much. But this time around, I do advocate for more tolerance and understanding. Many hearing parents are getting their kids implanted, and many of those kids are someday going to join the deaf community. It is our responsibility to welcome them. If we spend too much time criticizing their decisions instead of just educating them about the positive aspects of the deaf community, we will push them away and it will be our loss. No, the Cochlear Corporation of America did not bribe me to soften my stance. What actually happened was I went out and had a few kids of my own, gory details to follow in an upcoming chapter. After becoming a father, I noticed that every idiot and his brother was bombarding me with advice on how to raise my kids. And now I completely understand how hearing parents feel when deaf people like myself are too outspoken against their choices that are none of my business. Okay, that's enough about cochlear implant. Now let's get back to PSD and move on. Obviously, getting a job at PSD was an incredibly positive experience. In the 2 years I worked there as a resident advisor, I slowly grew a strong sense of deaf identity. Being with other deaf people and with hearing people who signed gave me an opportunity to be completely involved in a more enriching way than I'd ever had before. Rather than being an observer, I was usually an active participant. Other staff actually valued my input and opinions. Although I still needed to refine my signing skills somewhat, I felt like an equal amongst them. I enjoyed working with the kids in the dorm, and it took me a while to get used to the fact that they actually looked up to me. Big deal. Some people might say, as I was just a dorm counselor. But it was the first time I could recall anyone, anywhere, ever looking up to me. In all my years of succeeding in a tough academic environment at GFS, I had never once considered myself to be a leader, nor had I ever imagined that I had the potential to be one. At PSD, this was my very first taste. Although my kids looked up to me, deep down inside I looked up to them. Right before my very eyes, they were developing social and leadership skills I had never had when I was their age. Everyone interacted as an equal, and it was reflected on their self-esteem and confidence. Anytime a kid disagreed with something, he or she would say so. Anytime a kid felt that something could be done better, he or she spoke up and offered another suggestion. When I was in school, I didn't dare rock the boat. I was too busy playing catch up, too busy trying to fit in with hearing people, with my hearing family, with my hearing classmates, and in my relationship with a hearing girlfriend. I had always felt I had to be super nice and super perfect to be accepted. There's nothing wrong with being a nice guy or trying to be the best you can be, but when you do so at the expense of your true inner feelings, it just doesn't work. It's called living a lie. For example, earlier I mentioned that with my hearing girlfriend Karen, I would willingly go to movies with her and pretend to enjoy it because I didn't want her to feel bad. I wanted to be accepted, to be seen as a normal guy who could do anything with her. At PSD, on the other hand, I encountered students many years younger than I who said, "Nah, I don't like to go to the movies. They're not captioned. I'd rather wait for the videos to come out and then watch it captioned on my VCR." A generation later, these same kids would successfully advocate on behalf of getting captions added to movie theaters so they could go out and enjoy a nice evening at the movies with their families. These kids were being genuine, living in the present moment, and accepting fully who they were and what they felt. There was nothing wrong with being deaf, nothing wrong with waiting for caption videos to come out. They knew it. I didn't. These kids were wise beyond their years and way ahead of me. Chronologically speaking, I may have been 22 years of age at the time, but the real me, the fully actualized deaf Mark Drosselbaugh, was only about 1 or 2 years old.